Chapter 1. The late spring sun glimmered across the stone-paved lanes of Little Welford. A village so picturesque it could have been snipped from the pages of a county calendar. Alongside the burbling stream that gave the place its quiet charm, stood the Babbling Brook bistro, a newly opened tea-room with whitewashed walls, floral bunting, and mismatched bone china that made the ladies of the Women's Guild swoon with approval. Inside, the air was fragrant with bergamot and buttered scones. The chatter of lace-gloved hands and chintz-covered chairs hummed like a hive, every conversation layered with more meaning than it first appeared. Miss Marple sat by the corner window, a modest figure in a dove-grey cardigan and straw hat. She sipped her Darjeeling without hurry, her pale eyes drifting, not staring, over the assembled patrons. She wasn't listening so much as absorbing. That was the thing about Miss Marple. She had a way of hearing everything, even when she appeared quite lost in her knitting. "Oh, the lemon drizzle is heavenly," gushed Mrs. Ivy Fawcett, plump and rosy-cheeked, seated at the central table. "Made fresh, they say, with French lemons. Imagine!" "Imported lemons," sniffed Miss Myrtle Edgecombe, her voice laced with scepticism. "Seems terribly extravagant for a village bistro, if you ask me." "Extravagant is the point," purred a smooth voice. "The bistro isn't for villagers, it's for tourists." All heads turned, some subtly, others not, as Astrid Lovell swaned in. A decade younger than most in the room, Astrid wore a silk scarf knotted jauntily around her throat, and carried herself like she belonged somewhere grander than Little Welford. She wasn't a villager by birth, but she had recently purchased the old mill cottage and announced her intention to bring life to the place. The Babbling Brook bistro was her doing. Miss Marple observed the faint tightening of Myrtle's jawline. Ivy's fingers faltered on her teaspoon. Even the young waitress behind the counter, a pretty thing with clever eyes and bitten nails, looked up sharply, then busied herself polishing already clean glassware. There was tension beneath the tea and lemon drizzle. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I imagine tourists appreciate a slice of real village charm, though perhaps not quite as real as our local politics." Astrid laughed, not unkindly. "Quite right, Miss Marple. But even charm needs polish. Don't you think I'm simply giving Little Welford a bit of sheen?" From the opposite end of the room, a man cleared his throat. "Careful, Astrid," he said. "You'll buff it so hard you'll wear it thin." It was Hugh Langley, former journalist, now a semi-retired novelist of modest success. His limp was old, from a war injury, but his tongue was still sharp. Astrid's smile flickered. "You exaggerate, Hugh." "Do I? You've modernized the old post office, convinced the vicar to install cafe lights in the churchyard, and now you're turning the pub into a wine lounge. What next? Artisanal flat whites on the cricket green." A titter went around the room, though no one quite met Astrid's gaze. She stood frozen for a moment, then turned her head slowly. "My ventures have brought money and footfall to Little Welford, but if you prefer it to remain stuck in 1952, do say." Miss Marple's eyes remained on the girl behind the counter. Lila, her name was. Lila's shoulders had gone rigid. Moments later, as Astrid seated herself at a table and ordered a soy cappuccino, a word that made Myrtle Edgecombe blanch, Lila disappeared through the swinging door into the kitchen. The bell above the door chimed again. In stepped Arthur Briggs, local councilman, bald as a billiard ball, carrying his bowler like it was a badge of office. He scanned the room, saw Astrid, and made directly for her. "Miss Lovell," he said, "a word, if I may." "Of course." She rose, casting a brief, unreadable glance toward the rest of the room. They disappeared through the glass doors into the garden seating area. Within moments, gossip unfurled like smoke. "I heard the bistro doesn't even have the proper licenses," Myrtle whispered to Ivy. "Arthur wouldn't let that stand." "Not unless someone else is standing on his behalf, if you follow." "Oh, you don't mean—" Miss Marple stirred her tea quietly. She didn't need to hear the rest. Soon the atmosphere shifted. Astrid re-entered the room, cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but fury. Arthur trailed behind her, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Astrid walked straight to the counter, called out for Lila. No answer. "Where is that girl?" she snapped. "She stepped out back, miss," replied the cook, a squat man with a rolling gait. "Typical," Astrid muttered, and returned to her seat. Miss Marple blinked slowly. It wasn't much, but the whole thing had a scent about it. Not just the row with Arthur, not just the strained smiles or Lila's sudden vanishing, but something in the air, a subtle flicker of tension, a performance fraying at the edges. The next day the sun rose over Little Welford like it always did, gentle, golden, comforting. But by mid-morning the gossip had turned to gasps. Astrid Lovell had been found dead in the kitchen of the bistro, collapsed beside the stainless steel sink. No wounds, no signs of trauma. Just a spilt cup shattered on the tiles, and her body crumpled like a dropped marionette. It was Lila who found her. The coroner, when summoned, shook his head solemnly and muttered something about shock or a sudden reaction. A touch of fainting, perhaps a heart attack. Hardly likely in a woman of 35, Miss Marple murmured. The police arrived by noon. Statements were taken. The locals speculated. But Miss Marple, having walked past the bistro's rubbish bins on her way to the post, had paused. Not long, just a moment. Just long enough to notice something strange. A broken bottle of almond essence, glass scattered like sugar crystals. Sticky streaks staining a paper napkin. She didn't say anything. Not yet. Anything. Not yet. But she noted the smell. It wasn't just almonds. It was something bitterer. Chapter 2. By the time the bell in the church tower rang 3 o'clock, the news had scattered through Little Welford like petals on the wind. No one said murder outright, not yet, but the word hovered beneath every sentence. Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her needlepoint in hand. The design, a modest row of violets, forgotten halfway through a stem. Her teacup remained untouched. The faint tick of the mantel clock was the only sound, aside from the low cooing of pigeons on the sill. She was thinking, not leaping to conclusions, certainly not declaring anything aloud. But certain details had snagged her mind, like thread on a thorn. A young woman, healthy, clever, ambitious, collapsing with no visible cause? Unlikely. Astrid Lovell had many qualities, but fragility was not one of them. A sudden knock disrupted the quiet. Mary Ellison entered, flustered and out of breath. "You've heard, I suppose, Aunt Jane?" Miss Marple nodded. "Do sit down, dear. You look quite as if you've chased the postman down the hill." Mary dropped into the armchair. "It's dreadful, absolutely dreadful. Lila found her, you know. The poor girl hasn't spoken a word since." "And what's being said?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. Mary looked slightly abashed. "Oh, you know how it is. Some think it was a fit. Others say, well, Myrtle Edgecombe is already whispering about poison." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Poison? That's quite a leap." Mary leaned in. "Lina said Astrid had just finished her tea when she collapsed. Ivy swears she saw her drink something from a china cup, and there was a smell. Bitter almonds, someone said." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "that does conjure a certain association." Mary's eyes widened. "You mean cyanide?" Miss Marple gave her niece a gentle look. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, my dear." By late afternoon, the village green had become a stage. Small clusters of residents gathered like hens before a storm, exchanging scraps of information, as if piecing together a puzzle. At the Babbling Brook bistro, Constable Ellis was doing his best to preserve some form of order. The small kitchen had been sealed off, and a constable from the neighbouring town was posted at the entrance. Lila sat on a bench outside the garden doors, wrapped in a blanket and cradling a chipped teacup she wasn't drinking from. Hugh Langley stood nearby, pipe unlit, in his hand, eyes on Lila. "She's in shock," he said as Miss Marple approached. "Can't say I blame her." Miss Marple nodded. "Poor child. Working for a woman like Miss Lovell can't have been easy. So much pressure to please." "True enough." Hugh's voice held a note of weariness. Astrid had a way of expecting obedience and gratitude in equal measure. Did Lila seem frightened of her? Hugh considered this. Not frightened, no, but wary. Astrid could be exacting. Miss Marple tilted her head. "That often hides insecurity." He gave her a sideways glance. "You think someone meant her harm?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that sudden deaths deserve careful observation." Before Hugh could reply, a new voice cut in, sharp and officious. "Mrs. Marple." It was Inspector Denham, recently assigned to the county. Young for his post and keen to establish his authority, Denham carried himself with the energy of someone who believed decisiveness equaled correctness. "Yes, Inspector." "I'll need to speak with you in due course. You were present yesterday, I'm told." "I was enjoying tea. I don't believe I witnessed anything of significance." "We'll let the interviewers determine that," he said crisply. "We're treating this as a suspicious death." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I rather thought you might." That evening, the Women's Guild met at the village hall as scheduled, though the conversation never strayed far from Astrid's demise. What had she eaten? Who served her tea? Was it possible someone had slipped something in her drink while she argued with Arthur Briggs in the garden? Myrtle Edgecombe was adamant. "It was poison, I tell you. There's no other explanation. I always said she'd make enemies, storming in and changing everything. Turning the post office into a gift shop was the final insult. I thought you rather liked the scented candles Mrs. Fawcett offered." Myrtle ignored her. "And those dreadful soy cappuccinos. If you ask me, she was courting disaster." Miss Marple let the conversation flow around her, absorbing it all. What struck her wasn't the indignation, nor the accusations. It was the quiet silence of those who said nothing. Arthur Briggs, notably absent from the meeting, and Lila, who still hadn't spoken a word. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Reverend Chiswell. The vicar's house was tidy but worn, its books well thumbed and furniture sun-faded. He welcomed her with warm hands and a furrowed brow. "I dare say the Lord would approve of your concern, Jane," he said as he poured tea. "Though I'm afraid I have very little to—" offer. It's not official business, dear Reverend. I was merely wondering about Arthur Briggs. Have you seen him since the incident? Reverend Chiswell hesitated. He came by last night, late. Said he needed to pray. He seemed shaken. Not guilty, then? No, the vicar said slowly. Grieved, not weeping, mind you, but heavy with something. Remorse, perhaps, or regret. Miss Marple stirred her tea with a faint clink. Did he say what they argued about? He didn't, but he left this behind. The vicar rose and opened a drawer, producing a folded leaflet, part of a planning proposal. It bore the council letterhead and Astrid's signature. Miss Marple unfolded it, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was a proposal for a new car park on the site of the village allotments. No wonder the villagers were up in arms, she said. Yes, Arthur had tried to delay it, but she threatened to take it to the county council directly. So the bistro wasn't her only project, Miss Marple murmured. She was building an empire. The vicar nodded gravely. By midday, a preliminary report from the county pathologist arrived. Inspector Denham announced it to a small assembly on the green. Cause of death is inconclusive. No wounds or signs of injury. Toxicology pending. They've taken samples for poison testing. And the almond smell? Someone asked. We won't speculate, Denham snapped. The investigation is ongoing. Miss Marple simply smiled. That afternoon she wandered back to the bistro. The police had gone, but the place remained locked. Behind the building, she walked past the refuse bins again. This time she noticed something else, something tucked behind a broken crate. A tin of marzipan sweets, half empty, with the paper liner stained. Marzipan sweets, half empty, with the paper liner stained. She picked it up gently, as if it might bite. Marzipan, almond scent, an easy cover for something more lethal. Miss Marple stood in the alley a moment longer, thinking of tea, tense arguments, and Lila's silence. So many threads. But already one pattern was beginning to form. Chapter 3. The village of Little Welford had always regarded silence as a virtue. Quiet lanes, quiet gardens, quiet evenings. But now the silence felt loaded, like something crouching in wait. Conversations hushed when footsteps passed. Even the birds seemed subdued. And at the heart of this hush was Lila. No longer behind the bistro counter, the young waitress had retreated to her aunt's cottage on Birchwood Lane. The blinds were kept half-drawn. Visitors were discouraged. The village interpreted this as grief. Miss Marple suspected otherwise. She chose mid-morning to call. The sun was gentle, casting thin shadows, and Miss Marple came bearing a tin of shortbread biscuits, not to force conversation, but to be present, quietly and politely. Lila's aunt, Mrs. Granger, opened the door with a harried look. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm not sure she's up to—" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I won't stay long. Just wanted to drop these off. Perhaps they'll help." Mrs. Granger hesitated, then stepped aside. Lila sat curled in the armchair, legs tucked beneath her, a cardigan too big for her small frame draped around her shoulders. Her face was pale, and her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness, but they were alert, watchful. Miss Marple placed the tin on the coffee table. "I used to make them for my nephew. He claimed shortbread made everything less confusing." A faint curve touched Lila's lips, then vanished. "You mustn't force yourself to speak, my dear," Miss Marple continued gently. "But if there's anything you remember, even something that seemed odd, it can help, you know, not just the police. It helps the soul." Lila didn't respond. But she reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and took one of the biscuits. Miss Marple waited a full minute, letting the silence stretch without pressure. Then she rose. "I'll come again in a few days, only if you'd like. But if you do wish to talk, you'll find me just past the rose hedge." Lila gave a barely perceptible nod. Outside, Mrs. Granger wrung her hands. "She hasn't spoken since it happened. Just stares at nothing. I think she saw something, more than she said. She's a good girl, Miss Marple, kept to herself, didn't gossip, but she saw things." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That's often the most dangerous quality in a village like ours." Later that day, Inspector Denham arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's cottage, his notepad tucked under one arm, and his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Marple, I'd like a word. May I come in?" "Of course, Inspector. Tea?" "No, thank you." He seated himself on the settee, glancing at the embroidery on the cushion beside him. Neat violets on a linen background. "I understand you've spoken with several people around the village, including Lila Granger." "I stopped by, yes. She didn't say much." He regarded her. That girl may be the only one who knows what really happened. Or she may simply be overwhelmed. She worked closest to the victim, was in the kitchen only moments before Miss Lovell collapsed. That places her at the scene. Miss Marple met his gaze evenly. "Being present does not make one guilty, Inspector. I'm sure you'd agree." He didn't reply at once. Then, "The toxicology report came in this morning. Trace amounts of cyanide, enough to confirm poisoning." Miss Marple gave the smallest of nods. "I suspected as much. We found nothing to indicate how it was administered. The teacup she used had residue, but not enough to prove it was in the tea. No fingerprints either." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. Denham frowned. "You think something's being missed?" "I think," she said, "that when a poison is used so precisely, so sparingly, we're dealing with someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and who perhaps understood human nature better than chemistry." Denham tapped his pen absently. "There's no shortage of suspects, you know." Astrid Lovell stepped on many toes. Briggs had a bow with her. Hugh Langley clashed with her vision for the village. Even Myrtle Edgecombe loathed her modernization efforts. "And all of them," Miss Marple said gently, "are far too expected." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You don't think it was one of them?" "I think the obvious suspects are rarely the right ones." That evening, Miss Marple visited the vicarage again, not to discuss suspects, but to ask for a book. Reverend Chiswell blinked in surprise. "Tennyson?" "Yes," Miss Marple said with a slight smile. "There's something quite comforting about his poetry in unsettled times." He fetched the slim volume from a high shelf. "You're troubled?" "I'm curious," she replied. "There are patterns forming, but they're not quite in focus yet." "Would prayer help?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "In its way. But so does paying attention to the quietest people." Meanwhile, Hugh Langley had resumed his afternoon walks along the stream. He was seen pausing near the bistro's garden fence, staring at the closed building with an unreadable expression. He smoked more than usual, and when questioned later, he admitted to something that raised more than a few eyebrows. "I once had a drink with Astrid," he told Denham. "She was charming, clever, and ruthless. She told me people were pawns if you kept smiling while you moved them." "Did you feel threatened by her?" Denham asked. "Threatened?" Number Hugh paused. "But I think others were." He looked pointedly toward the village green, where Arthur Briggs was pacing alone, hands clasped behind his back like a man balancing something heavy. 2 days after Astrid's death, the bistro reopened briefly under police supervision. Miss Marple received quiet permission from Constable Ellis to sit for a few minutes at her old table, so long as she didn't touch anything under seal. She obliged. She sat, watched the garden door, recalled the scene as it had been. Astrid returning from the garden, cheeks flushed, anger in her step, her demand for Lila, the disappearance, the tea. Her eyes landed on the counter. A silver tray sat beneath the glass, a daily rotation of sweets. Marzipan had been offered that day, not unusual. But what if the poison hadn't been in the tea? What if it had been in the marzipan? Easily disguised. Almond scent, a perfect delivery. Miss Marple let the idea settle. Then she asked the constable a single question. Did anyone check which hands prepared the fruits that day? Constable Ellis blinked. No, ma'am, why? Oh, just a thought. She stood slowly. I believe I'll go home and do a bit more needlework. Back on Birchwood Lane, Lila finally spoke. Just 3 words, spoken to her aunt that evening, almost whispered. She liked marzipan. Mrs. Granger froze. Who, dear? But Lila said nothing else. Still, it was enough. The silence had cracked, and Miss Marple, in her parlour that night, began to stitch a very different kind of pattern into her mind. Not a floral one, but one made of motives, of movements, and of sweet things that masked bitter truths. Chapter 4. The next morning dawned cooler than expected, with a sharpness to the breeze that seemed to cut through the hedgerows. Miss Marple was already dressed and sipping her first cup of tea before the church bell had struck 7. She watched the lane through the parlour window, as she often did, noting the subtle differences in how people walked when they were trying not to be seen, especially those who were used to walking with purpose. Arthur Briggs passed her garden gate just before 8, head bowed, shoulders hunched forward. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A man with nothing to hide seldom looked at his feet. Over at the Babbling Brook bistro, Constable Ellis and Inspector Denham had convened to review the findings again. The toxicology results had confirmed Miss Lovell died from cyanide poisoning, but the method remained elusive. No one saw her take anything but tea, Denham muttered, flipping his notebook closed. Yet the residue on the teacup was minimal. Constable Ellis hesitated. What about those sweets? Marzipan? Yes, she had one with her tea, I think. Lila said she served it with the tray. Denham looked up sharply. Then why didn't the toxicologist test the sweets? They were half gone by the time we got there. Could have been thrown out. Kitchen waste was scattered. Rats got to some of it, I think. Denham cursed under his breath. We need to find out who prepared the sweets that day. Lila claims Astrid made them herself. Of course she does, Denham muttered. She's either protecting someone, or she's lying. Miss Marple, meanwhile, made a quiet stop at the greengrocer's, and left with a modest paper bag in hand. She walked slowly through the village, stopping just long enough to exchange pleasantries, but not invitations. Her destination was the home of Myrtle Edgecombe. Myrtle answered the door in a flurry of perfume and patterned housecoat. Miss Marple, what a surprise! Just thought I'd drop by with some candied peel. Mr. Collins said he'd ordered too much again, and I couldn't let it go to waste. Oh, how thoughtful! Come in, won't you? Miss Marple stepped into the front parlour. which was cluttered in the manner of someone who couldn't resist buying every ceramic animal she ever came across. "I imagine things have been quite lively at the Guild," Miss Marple said mildly. Myrtle sighed dramatically. "You could say that. People are on edge. No one wants to be the next subject of gossip, but everyone's dying to be the first to hear it. And what's the consensus now? Oh, theories are flying like sparrows. Some think Astrid poisoned herself by accident. Others are whispering that Lila was in love with Arthur Briggs and wanted Astrid out of the way. Nonsense, of course. The girl's barely 20. And yet she seems to have stirred quite the story." Myrtle leaned in. "You know what I think, Jane? I think Astrid knew too much. She was always watching people, making notes. She had a little black book, did you know?" Miss Marple blinked slowly. "A black book? I saw her jotting things in it, names, times. She told me once it was just for organizing rotas and supply orders, but I don't believe it. I think she kept records." "That would be very dangerous, if true." Myrtle nodded with satisfaction. "Exactly what I thought." Later that day, Miss Marple visited the vicar again, not to borrow a book, but to return one. As they stood in the study, she casually inquired, "Reverend, do you know anything of a black notebook Miss Lovell kept?" Chiswell frowned. "I believe I saw her with it during the planning meetings. Very precise she was. Carried it everywhere. She used to flick through it during discussions about zoning. And where might it be now?" "I've no idea. The police didn't mention it. Perhaps it's at her cottage." Miss Marple tapped a finger gently against her chin. "Do you know who has the key?" "I believe Lila did. Astrid trusted her with it. Said she had an eye for keeping things in order." Miss Marple decided the time had come to speak with Lila again. This time the girl was not curled on the sofa, but standing by the window, watching the path outside as if expecting someone who might never arrive. "I thought I'd bring you something," Miss Marple said, holding up a small paper-wrapped parcel. "It's just a bit of rhubarb cake. Made it this morning. My nephew used to say it was more effective than aspirin." Lila didn't smile, but she accepted the parcel and motioned toward a chair. Miss Marple took a seat. After a moment, she spoke softly. "I've been told Astrid kept a notebook." Lila's shoulders stiffened. "I don't mean to pry, dear, but if someone wanted that notebook gone, they might go to great lengths." Lila's voice, when it came, was thin but clear. She wrote things down. Things people told her when they thought she wasn't listening. She said it was good business. Was there anything about Arthur Briggs in it? Lila looked away. She said she had proof that he'd taken council money, paid for the bistro's patio stones with a community grant. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And she told you this?" "She was angry. Said she'd go public if he didn't approve the wine lounge conversion." "And the notebook?" Lila hesitated, then whispered, "It's hidden." "At her cottage, behind the false panel in the pantry." Before dusk, the police had the notebook in hand. Inspector Denham flipped through its pages with grim satisfaction. There it was. Names, figures, details about every person who had crossed Astrid. Blackmail fodder with receipts. Briggs, Langley, even Myrtle Edgecombe, who's once begged Astrid to remove a parking fine her son had incurred. "You were right," Denham admitted to Miss Marple. "She was collecting secrets." "Secrets," Miss Marple said softly, "are only dangerous when someone feels cornered." "And now," Denham said, "we've got motive for nearly everyone in this village." He stared at the final entry. It was recent, a single line. Even she wouldn't suspect a sweet gesture. Denham frowned. She who? Miss Marple stood very still. The handwriting was neat, controlled, confident. I think, she said, we're about to find out. Chapter 5. By the following morning, the quiet of Little Welford had grown brittle. The villagers continued their routines, but something tense and artificial clung to every smile and wave. A layer of performance sat atop the everyday pleasantries. One that Miss Marple, seated quietly by her window with her embroidery, recognized all too well. People were beginning to wonder just how much Astrid Lovell knew, and who had the most to lose. The black notebook had thrown the village into subtle disarray. While its contents had not been made public, word of its existence had trickled out. Gossip now mingled with dread. At the centre of it all was Arthur Briggs, councilman, neighbour, and at least on paper, compromised. Miss Marple encountered him at the post office that morning. He was usually brisk and affable, but today he was hunched over the post counter, murmuring to the clerk in tones far too quiet for a man so used to projection. Mr. Briggs, she greeted warmly. He startled slightly, then forced a smile. Miss Marple, lovely day. Lovely indeed, though I dare say some might find the air a touch heavy. He blinked. Oh. Guilt, she added gently, is a surprisingly weighty thing. Briggs stiffened. If you're implying something— Not at all, she interrupted. Though it is curious, isn't it, that Astrid's notebook disappeared so quickly after her death, as if someone knew precisely where to look. He turned pale. I didn't even know about the notebook until yesterday. Of course not, she said, and smiled kindly. And yet you were the last person seen arguing with her. Before she died, that is. Arthur Briggs left the post office with a fumbling of coins and no stamps. Miss Marple stood quietly, watching him go. That afternoon, Inspector Denham stopped by the vicarage. The Reverend Chiswell welcomed him with his usual serenity, though the inspector's manner suggested he wasn't here for a sermon. You've known Miss Marple longer than I have, Denham said. Would you say she plays games? The dark vicar chuckled. Only the kind where she already knows the winner before the pieces move. Denham sighed. She's hinted that someone used sweets to poison Astrid Lovell, that the poison wasn't in the tea at all. She did mention marzipan, the vicar offered. Yes, and now we have a notebook entry suggesting Astrid herself knew something was coming, something disguised as kindness. That could mean anything. Not to Jane. Meanwhile, Lila had begun speaking more, if sparingly. Miss Marple visited again in the early evening, this time with a small posy of sweet peas wrapped in tissue. She found the girl sitting in the garden behind her aunt's cottage, watching bees flit among the hydrangeas. You're very quiet again today, Miss Marple said gently. Lila shrugged. People have been asking questions. They always do, after something unexpected. She was mean sometimes, Lila said suddenly. Miss Lovell, I mean, not cruel, just sharp. Sharpness can cut deeper than cruelty. She made me feel invisible when she wanted to, but then sometimes she'd give me little things, a bracelet, leftover pastries. Once she gave me a marzipan sweet and said I deserved something pretty and soft. Lila paused. I think she meant it. Miss Marple tilted her head. And did anyone else share those marzipan sweets? Lila hesitated. Sometimes. Mostly she ate them herself. But once Mrs. Edgecombe brought a batch for the counter. said they were homemade. That caught Miss Marple's attention. Did she now? The next day Miss Marple attended the Women's Guild as usual. Myrtle Edgecombe, resplendent in a lavender blouse and layered pearls, was regaling the other ladies with stories of her great-nephew's trip to Edinburgh. Miss Marple waited until the room had quieted from laughter before speaking. "I've been meaning to ask, Myrtle," she said lightly. "Did you enjoy baking for the bistro? Lila mentioned you occasionally brought treats." Myrtle beamed. "Oh, yes, only once or twice. It gave the place a homier touch, I thought. My almond marzipan is quite famous, you know." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And was Astrid fond of them?" Myrtle flushed slightly. She always said they were delightful. But she never asked for the recipe. Certainly not. She never cooked a thing herself. Miss Marple smiled. "Curious. I always found it risky to accept food from someone one doesn't fully trust." There was a pause. Then Myrtle said, a bit too brightly, "Well, I suppose people are more trusting than they should be." That night, Miss Marple set her own little trap. She prepared a small plate of almond marzipan sweets, plain, soft, entirely harmless, and placed them in a decorative tin. She wrapped it in cellophane and attached a note in neat script. "In memory of your generous baking, I thought I'd try my hand at it. Yours, sincerely, Jane Marple." She delivered the parcel herself the next morning. Myrtle Edgecombe opened the door with a practised smile that faltered the moment she saw the tin. "Oh," she said, "how thoughtful." "Just something sweet," Miss Marple replied. "Do let me know what you think." She turned before the other woman could stammer an excuse. She didn't need to see what Myrtle did with the tin. She only needed to wait. By midday, Inspector Denham received an anonymous call from the pharmacy. Myrtle Edgecombe had inquired after something that could induce vomiting, insisting it was for a friend's dog who'd eaten something bad. The pharmacist, wary after the week's events, had called the authorities. Denham didn't hesitate. He brought Miss Marple with him when he arrived at Myrtle's door. "I don't know what this is about," Myrtle cried. "I haven't done anything wrong." Miss Marple looked gently at her. "Dear Myrtle, you did what many people in this village have done. You underestimated how carefully people remember kindnesses." Myrtle went very still. "You thought Astrid wouldn't taste it. That one marzipan sweet laced with just enough to make her feel ill, perhaps to send a warning. But you didn't expect her to react so violently. You didn't know how much was too much." Myrtle shook her head. "I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted her to back off, to stop pushing people around, ruining the village. But she'd already discovered your son's legal troubles," Miss Marple said calmly, "and noted it down. She was threatening to publish the names of everyone who'd asked her for favors. You couldn't allow that." Myrtle sank onto the floral sofa, her pearls askew. "She said she'd tell everyone." She smiled when she said it, like it was a game. "And so," Miss Marple said softly, "you baked her a gift." "And so," Miss Marple said softly, "you baked her a gift." Chapter 6. Myrtle Edgecombe's confession was not a dramatic affair. There were no tears, no loud proclamations of innocence or despair. Instead, there was a quiet deflation, a woman sinking slowly into the realization that she had crossed an invisible line and could never uncross it. "I only meant to scare her," she whispered, hands trembling in her lap. "Just one sweet." One Inspector Denham stood stiffly by the hearth. arms folded, expression unreadable. You dosed a marzipan sweet with cyanide. That's not a warning, Mrs. Edgecombe. That's attempted murder. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on Myrtle, not with judgment, but with a mournful kind of comprehension. She thought it was a game, Myrtle continued, voice hollow. All that power, the notebook, the secrets. But this village, it's not a stage, it's our home, and she kept digging. She died, Denham said, because you couldn't tolerate exposure. She died, Myrtle said bitterly, because she couldn't stop pushing. The official arrest came later that evening, discreet but firm. Myrtle Edgecombe was escorted from her home by 2 plainclothes officers, bundled into a car beneath the muted stares of neighbours who watched from behind parted curtains. The village stirred, but did not erupt. Little Welford was not the sort to scream over scandal. It murmured, it whispered. And while many were content to believe the matter closed, Miss Marple was not, because something didn't quite fit. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Reverend Chisel. The vicar was arranging hymnals in the parish hall when she entered. "I wondered," she began, "if you recall a particular conversation you once had with Astrid Lovel, perhaps about sin, or the weight of secrets." The vicar blinked. "Astrid, we spoke often. She liked to debate, never about her own sins, of course, always someone else's." "Did she ever mention feeling threatened?" The Reverend paused. "Only once. She said someone had left a note in her postbox. No signature, just a message. Careful who you cross. Not every recipe forgives." Miss Marple's breath caught, though she showed nothing. "She dismissed it as silly," the vicar continued, "but she kept the note, said it had a strange elegance to it." That afternoon Miss Marple asked to examine the black notebook again. Inspector Denham was hesitant. "Myrtle's confession matches the pattern. Her fingerprints were on the kitchen tin. The motive is clear." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but her intention wasn't to kill. She said so herself. And Myrtle, for all her flaws, isn't the type to lie effectively. Not for long." Denham frowned. "You think someone else capitalized on her attempt?" Miss Marple tapped the edge of the notebook. "I think someone saw opportunity, and slipped something stronger into something Astrid trusted." She flipped through the final entries again. The phrase, "even she wouldn't suspect a sweet gesture." That doesn't sound like fear. It sounds like knowledge. Confidence. Denham exhaled. "You think she knew she'd been targeted?" "I think she knew more than she let on. The question is, did she confide in anyone else?" Hugh Langley hadn't been seen in the village for 2 days. A former journalist with a penchant for observation, Hugh had remained peripheral throughout the investigation. Concerned, yes, but distant. Now, that absence stood out. Miss Marple found him on the footbridge over the stream, pipe dangling from his lips unlit. "Miss Marple," he said without turning, "come to ask if I've poisoned anyone lately." "Only if you've a recipe for marzipan and revenge." Hugh chuckled, then sobered. "It's awful about Myrtle. She made a choice, but not all of it fits." He glanced at her, brow furrowed. "She told me she wanted to frighten Astrid, and not finish her," Miss Marple said. "But the dose in the autopsy was high, lethal. It suggests a second act. Someone added to the damage." Hugh said nothing. "I wonder," she continued, "who else had access to the bistro that day, after Myrtle's sweets had been delivered, and before Astrid took her tea?" I imagine Lila could answer that, Hugh murmured. Or you could. His eyes met hers then. Cool, flat. I never touched her food. But you were there. You admit that. I stepped in for a coffee. I left when Arthur arrived. She confided in you once, Miss Marple said. She told you about the notebook. You warned her to burn it. She wouldn't listen. And when Myrtle's attempt didn't kill her, you made sure the second one would. For the first time, Hugh's hands trembled, not from guilt, but from fury. She was going to destroy people, he hissed. Not with justice, with smug satisfaction. She enjoyed power, Jane. Enjoyed watching people squirm. Even you saw it. I did, Miss Marple said softly. But I also saw a woman who trusted the wrong people, who played power without understanding its cost. Hugh turned back to the stream. I added a second sweet to the tray, while Lila was in the storeroom. It took seconds. Did you mean to kill her? He shook his head slowly. I meant to stop her. Miss Marple said nothing more. She turned and left him there, alone above the brook. That evening, Hugh Langley was taken quietly into custody. Myrtle's charge would be amended. She had tried and failed to frighten a woman who thought herself untouchable. Hugh had finished the job, not out of sudden rage, but with the cold deliberation of someone who had lived too long watching injustice win. Miss Marple gave her statement plainly, factually. She spoke of timing, of opportunity, of the notebook entries, of quiet hands and second chances. By the time the sun had set, the story of Astrid Lovell's murder had changed entirely. Chapter 7. Rain came softly the next morning, pattering over the thatched roofs and slicking the cobbled lanes of Little Welford. It was the kind of gentle drizzle that turned the village grey and thoughtful, as though the streets themselves were mourning. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her needle resting idle in her lap. The fire crackled quietly, but her thoughts were louder, racing ahead, weaving together the frayed ends of what had nearly been a perfect misdirection. Myrtle Edgecombe's confession had shaken the village, but it was Hugh Langley's quiet arrest that cracked the illusion. People now whispered not about secrets but about consequences. For the first time in years, they seemed to realize that even the most polished among them could be deeply, terribly flawed. Yet Miss Marple still felt an itch behind her thoughts. Something remained unsettled. She found Inspector Denham at the bistro's rear door, speaking with Constable Ellis beneath a shared umbrella. The bistro remained shut, still considered part of the investigation. The marzipan tray, the teacup, and the black notebook had all been logged as evidence, but Denham looked no closer to peace than the day Astrid died. "Miss Marple," he greeted, surprised. "I expected you'd be sitting comfortably by now, considering the matter resolved." "I am comfortable, Inspector," she said with a faint smile, "but not convinced." He frowned. Langley confessed. His opportunity was clear, his motive too. "I admit, I doubted at first, but it all aligns." "Does it?" she asked mildly. "Confessions, you know, can sometimes mask more than they reveal." Denham's patience frayed visibly. "You think he lied?" "Not entirely. But confessions made in controlled tones, with polished phrases, tend to worry me." She stepped inside the rear garden gate, without waiting for approval, and approached the narrow window-sill beneath the kitchen. She brushed a hand along the edge. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone examined the fingerprints around this area?" He glanced at Constable Ellis. Not specifically. Then do. That evening she made her final call of the day. Lila answered the door in her usual quiet way, but her eyes had lost their glassy stillness. Something had begun to return, a flicker of thoughtfulness, curiosity. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said. "Just a question." Lila stepped back, letting her in. Miss Marple remained by the door. "You once said Miss Lovell gave you marzipan sweets, but did you ever see her receive one? A sweet, that is, not from Myrtle, but from someone else?" Lila blinked, brows furrowing. "Yes, once." "Who?" Lila hesitated. "Mr. Langley. He brought her something once, a small box. She teased him for trying to impress her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And when was this?" "The morning before she died. He stopped by early, said he was dropping something off before his walk." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple wrote a short letter, 4 lines, unsigned, and folded it into an envelope. She handed it to young Peter, the errand boy, the next morning with a single instruction. "Deliver this to Mr. Langley's solicitor. Make sure you say it's urgent." Then she waited. By late afternoon, the solicitor himself arrived in Little Welford, visibly agitated. He headed straight for the police station. Inspector Denham met him at the door. "He didn't write it," the solicitor insisted. "The note in the black book, the final line, that wasn't his handwriting." Denham blinked. "Excuse me?" "I reviewed several of Hugh's old articles, compared samples from a manuscript he'd recently sent me. The phrasing might sound like him, but the script isn't. I'd stake my license on it." Constable Ellis entered then, holding a clipboard. "Sir, you'll want to see this. We dusted the kitchen windowsill like," Miss Marple suggested. "There's a partial palm print. Doesn't match Langley's." Denham's stomach twisted. "Then whose is it?" Miss Marple was knitting when the inspector arrived. "We've made a mistake," he said without preamble. Miss Marple didn't look up. "Only one." He sank into the opposite chair. "You were right. Langley lied, but not about the act, about the motive. He didn't kill Astrid." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "He confessed because he wanted to protect someone." Denham sat forward. "Protect who?" "Someone much younger, someone quieter, someone invisible." He stilled. "Lila." Miss Marple nodded once. She was the only person inside the kitchen at all the right moments. Myrtle's sweet may have made Astrid light-headed, but it wasn't lethal. The second one, the fatal one, was added later, by someone who knew the kitchen intimately. Denham exhaled slowly. She placed it on the tray. "No," Miss Marple said. "She watched someone else place it. Hugh Langley. He brought the second sweet under the guise of an apology. Astrid mocked him again. He left humiliated, but Lila saw him slip it into the tin." Denham stared at her. "But why not tell us?" "She was afraid, and loyal. But most of all, I suspect she didn't fully understand what she witnessed until it was too late." When Denham returned to the station, he found Hugh Langley pacing. "You knew," Denham said, voice low. "You didn't kill her, but you saw who did, and you took the blame." Langley turned slowly. "She's just a girl. Astrid chewed her up, threatened to fire her in public, belittled her constantly. And you thought shielding her would save her? She doesn't belong in prison. Neither do you." Langley looked tired. "Too late for that now." But Denham wasn't done. It wasn't Lila either. Langley frowned. "The print on the kitchen sill, it wasn't hers. It was Astrid's." Langley's expression flickered. Something like confusion, then dawning realization. She left herself open, Denham continued. She discovered your history. Those columns you buried, the libel case, the retractions. She knew you'd lied in print. She was going to expose you next. Langley slumped into the chair. I thought I was saving her, he said, but I was only saving myself. That evening the rain cleared. Miss Marple stood alone in the bistro garden, watching the brook that babbled beneath the willow. It whispered its secrets gently, tirelessly, just as the village always did. 2 people had tried to poison Astrid Lovell. One meant to scare her, one meant to kill, but only one person had really set it in motion. Miss Marple sighed and walked home. There were no celebrations, only reflection. Chapter 8. Sunday came with golden light, and the faint scent of cut grass on the breeze. Church bells chimed across Little Welford, drawing villagers in tidy rows toward pews and hymns. The quiet hum of normalcy returned, but it was a different quiet now. Warier, measured. The murder at the Babbling Brook bistro no longer sat at the centre of conversation. It hung behind it, in the pauses and looks exchanged over hymnals and teacups. Miss Marple, dressed in her pale lavender suit with a modest brooch pinned just below the collar, attended service as always. She sat 2 pews from the front, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes remained fixed on the altar, but her mind worked in quiet loops. She had begun to see it, the why behind the how. After the final hymn, the vicar shook hands at the church door, offering warm farewells and promises to pray for Myrtle Edgecombe, now awaiting trial at a facility just beyond the county line. Miss Marple waited until the line thinned before approaching. "A beautiful sermon, Reverend." "Reverend?" He bowed his head. "You always say that." "Because it's always true," she replied, though today I found myself distracted. He looked at her concerned. "You see, I've been thinking about kindness, how it's often the most effective disguise." "Disguise? Oh yes," she said lightly. "Sometimes the kindest gestures conceal the coldest intentions. And sometimes well-intentioned people lend help to something darker, without knowing it." Before he could ask what she meant, she gave a small, regretful smile and added, "Astrid Lovell was clever, but not wise." "And Lila, she's young but not blind." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked the lane toward Lila's cottage once more. The air was still, the light honeyed. She found the girl kneeling in the garden, gently pulling weeds from between rows of lavender. "Miss Marple," Lila said, looking up. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Miss Marple said gently. "I brought you something." She held out a small cloth-wrapped parcel. Lila unwrapped it carefully to reveal a spool of thick linen thread and 2 bone-handled embroidery needles. "I thought you might take up needlework. It helps the hands and focuses the thoughts." Lila smiled faintly. "Thank you." Miss Marple sat on the edge of the garden bench. "It's been quite a week, hasn't it?" Lila nodded. "It doesn't feel real yet. About Miss Lovell, about Mr. Langley." Miss Marple murmured, and yet in a way it was inevitable. She paused. "May I ask you something very personal, my dear?" Lila looked at her warily, but nodded. "Did you love him?" Lila froze. The silence answered. Miss Marple continued gently. "You saw him place that second suite. You were the only one who could have, but you didn't say a word. Not even when Myrtle was accused. You let the whole village look the other way because you wanted to protect him." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but she said nothing. Miss Marple's voice softened further. "And yet I don't think it was Langley who truly poisoned Astrid." Lila's breath caught. Her eyes widened. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "He confessed to protect you, didn't he?" A long silence, then a whisper. "I didn't mean to kill her." "I know, child. She humiliated me," Lila said, trembling. "All the time. Called me simple. Said I was lucky to be around real people. But when she told me she was getting rid of me after the festival, when she said she didn't need my face behind the counter, something just snapped." "You saw Myrtle bring the sweets. You knew about the almonds. So you added a second dose." Lila nodded slowly. "I knew the almond scent would cover it. I'd cleaned up the kitchen after everyone left the day before. It was easy to slip in for a few seconds the next morning before the tea service started." Miss Marple sighed, deeply and quietly. "And Langley?" "He guessed. Maybe he saw something. I don't know. But he came to me the next night. Said he would confess if anything came close. Said it would never touch me. And you let him. I loved him," she said, voice breaking. Miss Marple stood slowly. "Love, dear girl, should never be paid in silence." She didn't say another word. Inspector Denham listened quietly as Miss Marple relayed everything. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he closed his notebook with care. "So we've arrested 2 people, and neither was the killer." "They were all involved," Miss Marple said. "Myrtle with her malice, Langley with his pride. But Lila was the only one who saw the full picture, and chose to act. She's barely more than a child. That's what makes it tragic." 3 days later, Lila Granger was taken into protective custody. The arrest was quiet. No cuffs, no fuss. Just a gentle escort down Birchwood Lane and into the back of a grey car. Some in the village would never believe she'd done it. Others would say nothing at all. The case was declared closed a week later. Headlines appeared in a few county papers. "Vintage Bistro, death solved. 3 arrested in shocking twist." The details were vague, respectful, deliberately forgettable. Little Welford preferred it that way. At the next meeting of the Women's Guild, Mrs. Fawcett brought orange sponge and insisted they return to their quilting project. The members spoke of fabric and teacups. No one mentioned Astrid Lovell, or Myrtle, or Lila. Only Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, said softly, "Perhaps we ought to try a new design, something simpler, more honest." That night, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the fire low, a book on her lap and a cup of cold tea untouched beside her. She didn't feel triumphant, just quiet. Murder always left something behind, something invisible. A silence, a scar, but this time justice had found its way through. It always did, eventually. Chapter 9. 2 weeks had passed since the bistro closed its doors, and though the official inquiry had ended, something else still lingered in Little Welford, an aftertaste, like oversteeped tea. Life resumed its routines, yet it wasn't the same rhythm. Something fundamental had shifted. The babble of the brook continued as always, cheerful and unbothered. But those who walked its banks now did so with more silence than chatter. Children played, but under the lowered voices of parents who had stopped believing in the idea of a purely innocent village. Miss Marple, on the other hand, had returned to her usual schedule. Visits to the greengrocer, Sunday services, the occasional stop at the library for a new volume of Tennyson. But all of it was surface calm. Beneath it, she was still chewing on a detail that refused to lie still. It came back to the teacup. One morning, she stopped by the police station with a single question for Inspector Denham. Did the final report confirm cyanide residue on the teacup? She asked lightly. Denham, seated at his cluttered desk, paused. Trace amounts. Not enough to be lethal. They believe it came from trace contamination, possibly from the spoon or the tray, depending on where it was handled. Did anyone test the underside of the cup? Denham blinked. The underside? Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes the most telling part of a thing is the bit no one sees. Denham called in Ellis immediately. Within an hour, the results came back. Faint traces of a different compound, bitter almond oil, directly smeared on the base of the cup. Miss Marple said only, then the real poison wasn't in the drink at all. It was on the vessel. She walked the village lane slowly that afternoon, umbrella tucked under her arm though the sky had cleared. A light breeze stirred the late summer hedges. She passed the locked bistro and paused, eyeing the large bay window with its flaking closed for investigation sign. Her mind wound back to the sequence. Myrtle brought marzipan. Lila watched Hugh place something on the tray. But if the fatal dose had not come from within the cup, or sweet, someone had smeared the poison where it would be absorbed not by ingestion, but by touch, skin contact. A subtle dose on the cup's underside, left where warm fingers would wrap naturally, repeatedly, over time. And Astrid, fond of gesturing as she drank, had likely done just that. Later that evening, Miss Marple stopped in at the vicarage. Reverend Chiswell greeted her with warm familiarity. "Twice in a fortnight, Jane. You'll make me vain. I've had a thought," she said, "about Lila, and what she didn't do." The vicar set aside his book and gave her his full attention. Lila believed she'd killed Astrid, Miss Marple said. She confessed as much, but her confession didn't quite explain the final detail. Chiswell waited, sensing something. Miss Marple continued. Lila thought she'd added a poisoned sweet. But what if that sweet was never eaten? What if Astrid's death was ensured before the tea tray even arrived? Chiswell's brows knit. Do you think someone else planted the fatal dose altogether? Yes, she said softly, and that someone used the belief in the sweet as camouflage. He leaned back. But who would have had that level of precision? Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She merely said, "Tell me, when Astrid came to you that last week, did she bring her own tea?" The vicar thought a moment. No, she asked Lila to prepare it. She said her hands were stained from gardening. Ah, Miss Marple whispered. That night she reviewed her notebook. Unlike Astrid's infamous ledger, Miss Marple's was plain and orderly, just gentle observations, nothing cruel. One note stood out. Mrs. Granger never takes sugar. Lila always forgets and brings it anyway, repeats the mistake weekly. A girl with poor attention to detail, and yet the poison had been exact. Not just the type, but the method of delivery. That wasn't panic, that was control. Too much control. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the last person she hadn't yet questioned, Mrs. Granger. The older woman welcomed her into the cottage with forced warmth and the scent of boiled cabbage. "You've come to see how I'm coping, I expect," she said. "Lila's absence has left a hole in the place." "I'm sure it has," Miss Marple said gently. "I wondered, did Astrid ever stop by here before she died?" Mrs. Granger blinked. "Astrid Lovell? Certainly not. I wouldn't have given her the time of day." "Strange, because a neighbour said they'd seen her walking up Birchwood Lane not long before her death." Mrs. Granger's fingers tightened slightly on her apron. Miss Marple smiled mildly. You were fiercely protective of Lila. Everyone knew. When the village dismissed her as simple, you stood behind her. She's not simple, Mrs. Granger snapped. She's sensitive. There's a difference. Miss Marple's tone remained kind, and when Astrid threatened to dismiss her, Mrs. Granger turned away. She had no right. You knew Lila would never survive the humiliation, Miss Marple continued. Astrid had a way of breaking people. So you decided to intervene, not with violence, with caution, with precision. Mrs. Granger's shoulders were stiff. Her back still turned. You cleaned the bistro's back kitchen every Tuesday morning, didn't you? Miss Marple asked quietly. They left the door open so the delivery men could drop things. No one would have questioned you. You'd helped before. It would have taken you less than a minute. A long pause, then she touched the cup before anyone else that day. Yes, Miss Marple said, because you knew she always rearranged the tray, even when someone else set it. Mrs. Granger turned. Her face was pale but composed. She made Lila cry, she said simply, mocked her, threatened her job, called her dim, in front of customers. Lila would never have survived it. So I stopped her. Miss Marple didn't speak. She would have ruined her. Quietly, Miss Marple said, and now Lila lives with the belief that she caused the death. She'll never know, Mrs. Granger said. I won't let her. But Miss Marple did let her. Later that evening, she visited Lila one final time. Lila opened the door with tired eyes and a soft, wary expression. Miss Marple took her hand. You didn't kill Astrid. Lila blinked. The second sweet was never touched. The poison was already in place before the tray was ever laid. I don't understand, she whispered. You don't need to, Miss Marple said gently. But you should understand this. Someone loved you enough to do something very wrong, for all the right reasons. Lila's eyes filled slowly. But it wasn't me, she said, trembling. Miss Marple pressed her hand gently. No, child, it never was. Chapter 10. The news of Lila's release did not spread quickly. It moved with deliberate silence, the kind villagers use when they don't know whether to mourn, celebrate, or forget. But Miss Marple noticed the shift. Fewer glances followed Lila when she walked to the grocer's. Children no longer fell silent when she passed. Even Myrtle Edgecombe's name was no longer spoken with pity, but with restraint. Justice had arrived in quiet increments. And still, Miss Marple felt the story was not yet done. Because while a body may lie still, a pattern, especially one tangled in guilt and silence, often continued weaving beneath the surface. She received a letter the following morning, delivered not by post but hand-placed through the mail slot in the early hours. The envelope was unmarked. Inside was a single folded page. You saw too much. Let it rest now, for her sake and yours. A friend. Miss Marple read it once. Then again her fingers brushed the grain of the paper, tracing the faint indent where the pen had pressed too hard. There was no fear in her expression, only resolve. That afternoon she returned to the bistro for the first time in days. The building remained closed, but the vines climbing its walls had begun to reclaim the edges of the signage, as if the village itself had decided to forget what had happened there. Miss Marple stepped around the side path and reached the rear garden. The willow tree dipped its leaves into the water. A few pale blossoms floated along the stream. From her pocket she withdrew the letter, and beneath the old garden bench, exactly where she had once found the marzipan tin, She slipped the page between a gap and the slats. A message left where only one person might return for it. Meanwhile, Inspector Denham was reviewing the official files for the final report. Lila, cleared. Hugh Langley, charges dropped. Myrtle Edgecombe, cleared. Hugh Langley, charges dropped. Myrtle Edgecombe, pending trial for attempted poisoning. Astrid Lovell, deceased, death by cyanide, administered through skin contact. And then there was Mrs. Granger. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no direct evidence, just implication. And yet, Denham tapped his pen against the edge of the desk. Motive, he murmured, means access, and the instinct to clean up every crumb afterward. He stood abruptly. That evening, Denham joined Miss Marple for tea. She poured for them both, hands steady, motion unhurried. You knew it was her, he said quietly. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Before Lila ever confessed, I suspected something was wrong with the shape of things, the timing, the symmetry. Then why didn't you say? Miss Marple stirred her cup. Because justice isn't always delivered best through headlines and handcuffs. Sometimes it's a matter of timing, of patience. Denham gave a small huff. You're not fond of courtrooms, are you? Oh, I believe in them, she said. But I believe more in truth finding its way into people's bones, quietly, where it stays. He sipped his tea. You think Mrs. Granger will confess? Number, I don't believe she ever will. She sees what she did as protection, not murder. She believes she saved Lila. Denham nodded slowly. But the truth, Miss Marple continued, isn't for her benefit. It's for the girl. Lila has to live with it. And she must know that truth isn't a punishment, but clarity. He set his cup down with a soft clink. You'd have made a good magistrate. I prefer gardens, she said. They grow truth at their own pace. The next morning, a curious thing happened. Mrs. Granger didn't open her curtains. No one saw her walk to the bakery. No clatter of teacups through the open kitchen window. No sense of her usual bacon and onions. By midday the vicar was called. He knocked gently, then more firmly. Eventually, a constable was summoned. They found her seated in her armchair, knitting in her lap, her hands still folded over the needles. A small fire crackled in the hearth. She had passed peacefully. No note, no signs of struggle. The doctor marked it as heart failure. But Miss Marple, when she heard the news, simply folded her hands and said nothing at all. At the funeral, Lila stood near the rear pew, shoulders stiff, eyes unreadable. She did not weep. Miss Marple approached only after the crowd thinned. She was your shield, Miss Marple said gently. Lila nodded. I didn't ask her to be. Number, but she stepped in just the same. She took the blame for something I thought I'd done. Sometimes people need to believe they're capable of darker things, Miss Marple said. It helps them grow lighter in the end. Lila looked at her for a long moment. Am I supposed to feel grateful? No, Miss Marple said quietly. Just free. 2 days later, the bistro quietly reopened under new management. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just a newly painted sign and a small chalkboard by the door that read tea, scones and fresh starts. Miss Marple visited on the second day. The new owner, a gentle-faced woman named Claire from Dorking, served her chamomile and shortbread with a smile. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner seat by the window. The same table, a different sun. Outside, the brook bubbled along. Children tossed pebbles beneath the willow tree, and the world, as it always did, moved forward. But Miss Marple's mind lingered, because beneath every pleasant moment lies the memory of something else, not haunting, just echoing. And in little Welford, the echo of one poisoned teacup would never truly fade. Chapter 11. A week had passed since the funeral, and little Welford had begun to settle once more into its carefully arranged rhythm. The morning milk rounds resumed. The church choir returned to rehearsing for Harvest Sunday. Even the chatter in the Women's Guild turned away from murder, back to cakes and cushion embroidery. But from Miss Marple, peace did not come with routine. The case had been solved, yes, formally closed with no remaining suspects, no lingering confusion. But murder, as she knew far too well, never truly ends. It fades, it folds itself into the quiet routines of those left behind, waiting patiently to be remembered. And there was still one thing she had not yet done. She waited until mid-morning before setting out, walking stick in hand, sensible shoes crunching the pebbles on the lane. A modest parcel was tucked under her arm, wrapped in brown paper and string. Her destination was the stone cottage at the edge of the village, Lila's new residence. After Mrs. Granger's passing, the vicar and local solicitor had arranged for Lila to remain there, with a small inheritance and part-time work at the village library. It was a quiet mercy, one no one had spoken aloud, but that everyone accepted. Lila opened the door before Miss Marple knocked. "I saw you coming," she said softly. Miss Marple smiled. "I thought we might share some tea." Lila hesitated, then stepped aside. The cottage had changed, not drastically, but the heavy lace curtains were gone, and sunlight streamed into the parlour where it once socked. A pot of rosemary sat on the window-sill. The air smelled of polish and lemon. Lila brought out a plain brown teapot, 2 cups, and a jar of biscuits. They drank in near silence. Then Miss Marple opened the parcel she brought. Inside was a small brass tin with faded lettering, Barrows and Sons, almond marzipan rounds. Lila stared at it. "Don't worry," Miss Marple said gently. "These aren't those sweets. This tin came from the antique stall at the Wednesday market. I thought you ought to have it." Lila's fingers closed slowly around the tin. "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because memory is best handled when we decide what to do with it. You could keep it, bury it, or turn it into something else. A button tin, a thread box." Lila looked down at it. "It still smells faintly of almonds. Memories usually do," Miss Marple said. They sat for several moments, the quiet between them warm rather than strained. "I've been thinking about her," Lila said finally. "Astrid," Miss Marple nodded. "She was cruel, but she could be exciting. She made things happen. People noticed her." "They also feared her," Miss Marple said gently. Lila didn't deny it. "She made me feel small, all the time." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "And yet you didn't hate her, not really?" "No," Lila said, a little surprised. "Not really." They sat with that for a while. Later, as Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky streaked with September's first amber, she thought about Lila's words. Not really. There was something honest in that, something more unsettling than hatred. Because to be harmed by someone and not quite hate them meant the harm had roots, personal, tangled, not clean enough to uproot. Miss Marple had seen it before. In other villages, other crimes, not all tragedies came from rage. Some were grown from disappointment. That evening, a letter arrived. It bore a London postmark and was addressed in bold, confident handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. She opened it carefully. "Dear Miss Marple, I am writing on behalf of the late Hugh Langley's publisher. In reviewing his final manuscript, we found a personal journal excerpt he requested to be delivered to you upon the resolution of a certain matter. Enclosed is the relevant page. Please consider this his last word. Sincerely, Margaret Tripp, Langley House Publishing, Miss Marple," unfolded the single page inside. The handwriting was unmistakably Hugh's, precise, elegant, faintly theatrical. I saw her place it, not the poison, just the teacup. She wiped the base with a cloth and smiled. I should have said something, but I knew in that moment that she'd done what I'd only imagined. I envied her clarity. I resented it too. That's why I confessed. Not to protect Lila, not truly, but to punish the one person who had dared to act when I only watched. In the end, we were all cowards. H.L. Miss Marple folded the page slowly and placed it in her drawer with the newspaper clippings. She did not cry. She'd read too many last words in her life. At the next meeting of the Women's Guild, Miss Marple brought along a tin of marzipan biscuits, homemade and utterly harmless. There were cautious glances, light-hearted murmurs, and one brave chuckle from Mrs. Fawcett before the first biscuit was eaten. "Delicious," said Myrtle's cousin Agnes, cautiously licking a crumb from her finger. "And entirely legal, I trust." Miss Marple smiled. "Entirely." The laughter returned. Slowly, tentatively, but it returned. On her walk home, Miss Marple passed the bistro again. The chalkboard outside bore a new message. Nothing is forgotten by the brook, but everything is forgiven in the pot. She paused, read it again, then smiled faintly and continued on. That night, she took out her own notebook. She wrote a single sentence across the fresh page. Some crimes are never meant to be solved by the law, but only understood by the heart. Then she closed the book, and finally, she rested. Chapter 12. The final leaves of September fluttered down on little Welford in golds and russets, carpeting the garden paths and curling around cottage steps. The village had settled into its autumn routine. Conserves bubbling in kitchen pots, Wellingtons arranged near every back door, and hedgerows bustling with gossip about everything except what had happened at the Babbling Brook bistro. Miss Marple, as always, noticed what wasn't said. She noticed, for instance, how Agnes Edgecombe now paused before entering the church, as though listening for something in the silence. How Arthur Briggs had resumed his town council duties with a stiffness in his shoulders not entirely caused by arthritis, and how the new bistro owner, Claire, wiped the tables twice instead of once, perhaps to erase memories as much as dust. But most of all, Miss Marple noticed that Lila had begun to smile again, faintly, rarely, but genuinely. It was a Wednesday morning when Miss Marple returned to the bistro for the first proper meal since it reopened. The interior had been gently redone. Lighter curtains, paler wood, no trace of Astrid Lovell's signature crimson decor. Claire greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Marple, your usual table, if it hasn't been cursed," Miss Marple replied dryly. Claire chuckled. "Only blessed with extra sugar and silence." Tea was brought, along with the currant bun still warm from the oven. The fork was polished, the napkin folded just so. Miss Marple sipped slowly. Lila appeared from the kitchen then, carrying a tray with 2 fresh teacups. She froze slightly when she saw Miss Marple, but the older woman gave her the faintest of nods. Lila approached quietly. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here," Miss Marple replied. "It's rather difficult to imagine tea without your steady hands behind it." There was a silence. Then Lila whispered, "Do you think people will ever forget?" Miss Marple considered. "Number, but they'll stop needing to remember. That's better." Lila's throat bobbed as she nodded and returned to the counter. The next day Inspector Denham visited Miss Marple at her cottage. He brought a small box, sealed, official-looking. "I thought you might want the case file," he said. "It's being closed formally today. No trial, no more questioning." Miss Marple accepted the box without opening it. "Does it feel done to you?" Denham paused. "I don't think cases like this are ever done. But they settle." "That's a better word," she said softly. "They settle, like tea leaves." He smiled faintly. "You ever think of stopping?" "Solving murders?" "Yes." She poured him tea. "I never started. I just never learned how to ignore things." Denham sipped, then leaned forward. "Did she ever know, Mrs. Granger, that you'd figured it out?" "She knew," Miss Marple said. "That's why she left me the warning. Not to threaten me, but to end it, to make sure I wouldn't press Lila. She understood I was already letting her go. And if you hadn't, she'd have confessed, quietly, without fuss, but she would have." Denham nodded slowly. "You play a long game, Miss Marple." "I only watch carefully," she replied. By the following Sunday, the church was filled with soft organ music and the rustle of hymnals. Reverend Chiswell gave a sermon on healing, on how some wounds are not stitched but absorbed, changed into something else. Lila sat in the second pew, alone but upright. She looked neither ashamed nor proud, just whole. Miss Marple, 3 rows back, folded her gloved hands together as the final hymn rose around her. That afternoon she took out the case file from the box Denham had delivered. She laid the papers flat on the table and carefully removed the single photograph that had never made the papers. It showed Astrid Lovell laughing, eyes crinkled, head tilted slightly back, seated beside the bistro's window before its renovation, tea in hand, unaware of what would come. Miss Marple studied it for a long time. Then she slipped the photo into the back of her notebook and wrote beneath it, "Sharp minds make enemies, soft hearts make sacrifices, and quiet girls sometimes carry the weight of both." She closed the notebook and shelved it. 2 days later, a new letter arrived. This one hand-addressed by Lila herself. "Dear Miss Marple, I've planted marigolds by the bench near the brook, the ones you mentioned once, that push through even in stone cracks. I think Mrs. Granger would have liked them. I know I do. Thank you for seeing all of it, without judging all of me. Yours, Lila." Miss Marple placed the letter in her keepsake tin beside the embroidered handkerchief from a case years ago in St. Mary Mead. Another quiet end. Another life gently righted. One final note came from Denham at the end of the month. Typed, but with a small scrawl in the margin. "You were right again. I've asked for reassignment to cases involving fewer tea trays. P.S. The DCI says I'm developing a Marple complex. I took it as a compliment." She smiled at that, then folded the note, pressed it flat, and placed it beneath the kettle on her window-sill, where the steam curled upward in soft ribbons, fading into the afternoon sun. The brook continued its song. The bistro reopened its garden seating. The Women's Guild resumed their autumn bake sale preparations. And in the corner window seat, Every Tuesday, Miss Marple took her tea. 1 sugar, no lemon, watching the people of Little Welford live on. Not untouched, but still whole, still here. Chapter 13. October rolled in with a mist at its heels, blanketing Little Welford in a hush that deepened with every cool sunrise. The mornings were now edged with frost. Chimney smoke drifted over thatched roofs, and the leaves on the beech trees crackled brown and gold along the footpaths. The world, it seemed, was preparing for winter, but Miss Marple knew the difference between ending and closure, and she had one last call to make. It was a quiet Thursday when she walked down Birchwood Lane and arrived once again at Lila's door. The girl answered with less hesitation now, her posture more upright, her voice less breathless. "Miss Marple, would you care for a short stroll?" the older woman asked, her eyes kind. Lila blinked, then nodded. "Let me grab my coat." They walked along the brook in silence for several minutes, the water whispering beside them, the bistro barely visible through a curtain of low branches. The wooden bench Mrs. Granger once favoured was now flanked by 2 small pots of blooming marigolds, bright and brave against the creeping chill. Lila paused beside it. "I still dream about it sometimes," she said softly. "Not just Astrid, but that whole week, the teacups, the tray, the silence afterward." Miss Marple waited. "I used to think people only became heroes by doing something bold. Now I wonder if the bravest thing is knowing what not to do." "You didn't destroy Astrid," Miss Marple said gently, "but you believed you had, and you carried that weight rather than let it break someone else." Lila looked at her. "Do you think that makes me good?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I think it makes you ready." Later that evening, Miss Marple returned home and opened her sewing basket. She pulled out a plain cloth square, stitched in white thread, its design unremarkable. But the border was something new, a winding pattern of teacups, each different, each turning slightly. At the centre, a single phrase stitched in her steady hand. Some truths don't need to be shouted, just stitched in quietly where they'll last. She smiled, folded the cloth, and slipped it into the back of her bookcase, beside older notes, older patterns, other vintages, other crimes. That weekend, the Women's Guild met for the autumn fete preparations. Miss Marple brought lemon-curd tarts and 2 jars of preserved quince. The conversation swirled around her as she settled into her chair, this time not to observe, but simply to listen. Agnes Edgecombe was discussing new curtain trimmings. Ivy Fawcett was praising the jam entries for the Harvest Fair. Someone joked about banning marzipan altogether. The laughter that followed was genuine. Light, free of edge, it took time, Miss Marple thought, but eventually even fear forgets its way back in. At the village library, Lila took up her new duties. She organized the shelves in quiet loops, greeting patrons with soft confidence, her fingertips moving lightly across spines of books, checking for order and dust. One morning, she found a single volume on her desk, a copy of Cranford, with a note tucked into its pages. "For your shelf and your mind. Keep both in good order. Yours, J.M." Lila smiled and placed the book on display. One final thing remained. Miss Marple took the train to London. A rare event. She arrived at Langley House Publishing in the early afternoon and met with Margaret Tripp, the woman who had sent Hugh Langley's final note. Margaret welcomed her with warmth and curiosity. I never met Hugh in person, Miss Marple said, but I believe I understood him. Margaret smiled sadly. He was a man full of unfinished thoughts, regret wrapped in charm. Miss Marple handed her a small parcel. This was in his journal. It belongs with the rest of his words. Margaret unwrapped it carefully, revealing a folded draft page titled The Village and the Tea Room, a character study in poison. Beneath it, a handwritten footnote based on real events, but don't ask me how real. H.L. Margaret read it, then looked up. Do you think he knew how it would all end? No, Miss Marple said, but he hoped, and that's enough. Back in Little Welford, the bistro reopened for a harvest evening supper. Tables filled quickly, tea flowed, lanterns hung from the eaves in soft spirals of gold. Miss Marple took her usual seat by the window, sipping slowly. Claire approached near the end of the evening, setting down a small plate of sugared almonds. I wasn't sure if you liked these. Miss Marple smiled. Only when I know who's prepared them. Claire laughed. Fair point. She turned to go, then paused. Did you really solve it? The bistro thing? Miss Marple lifted her cup. I saw what everyone else missed, but I only did what needed doing. Claire tilted her head. You don't want recognition? Recognition spoils most good work, Miss Marple said. I prefer a warm cup and a clear conscience. Claire chuckled again and returned to the kitchen. As night settled and the last of the patrons left, Miss Marple stepped outside and walked once more by the brook. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight. She stood still and listened. Nothing stirred but the soft rush of current and the rustle of leaves. And that was enough. Not every ending needed ceremony. Some just needed stillness.